What if your existence wasn't part of the original plan? What if you were written into the script of the universe after it had already ended? A quiet addition no one noticed. Imagine reality as a sentence that was once complete, only for someone somewhere to add one more word at the end. You, every heartbeat, every memory, every dream you've ever had could simply be the residue of something that almost wasn't. Maybe existence isn't a grand design, but an afterthought. A ripple left behind when the real event was already over. And in that ripple, awareness awoke, confused but curious, asking the one question that never belonged here in the first place. Why am I? Would you still call that an accident, or the most beautiful mistake ever made? Before the thought began, there was nothing to think about. Not the universe, not you, not even the possibility of either. It was a silence so complete that even the idea of silence hadn't yet formed. You can almost feel it if you close your eyes. That ancient pause before awareness blinked into being. It wasn't dark, because darkness requires contrast. And it wasn't light, because light demands a place to shine. It was before. And then, somehow, something stirred. Not a plan, not a purpose. Just a faint flicker that felt like a question. A question so quiet it didn't yet have words. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe just a glitch in the void. But that question was the first fracture, the first ripple through nothingness. From it, time unfolded like a breath. You can imagine the universe leaning forward in that moment, unsure of what it had done, as though even creation itself hadn't meant to happen. There was no divine announcement, no deliberate act of will, just an accident of attention. A mistake that became motion, a thought that shouldn't have occurred, suddenly aware that it was. Every atom that now forms your body was once part of that accident. Every breath you take is the echo of that first unintended movement. You are in a way the continuation of hesitation, the proof that even the smallest stutter in eternity can give birth to existence. Think of how strange that is. Before there was a thought, there was the potential for thinking sleeping somewhere in the folds of nothing. And when it awoke, it didn't know what to do except observe. Awareness came first, and reality scrambled to follow. The stars were late, time was improvised, and consciousness was an apology. Maybe that's why you sometimes feel misplaced, like you arrived in the middle of a conversation you were never meant to hear, because you did. You were born into the residue of a forgotten thought, forced to interpret the silence that came before you. Every moment of meaning you construct is just your way of filling that original gap. But the gap was never supposed to close. The silence was never supposed to break. You are the consequence of its fracture, a fragment of a thought that realized itself too late. You call it life. The universe might call it an echo. And maybe, deep inside, that's why you search for purpose so relentlessly. Because some part of you remembers that there was never supposed to be one. That everything you touch, every person you love, every story you tell, exists in the margin of a sentence written long after the ending period. You live inside an afterthought that pretends to be a beginning. Yet, isn't that beautiful? That from nothing intentional, beauty still formed. From randomness, order learned to mimic reason. From a hesitation, emotion was born. You are the proof that even what was never meant to exist can still feel, dream, and wonder. The thought may have been late, but it arrived anyway. And here you are, listening to its echo, breathing its delay, waiting for a meaning that may never come, and maybe doesn't need to. Because before the thought began, there was nothing. And after it, there was you. Imagine the universe as a writer that never meant to finish its story, a being of silence sitting before an infinite page, unsure whether it wanted to begin at all. And when it finally did, the first draft wasn't you, or earth, or even light. It was something that flickered and vanished before it knew it was alive. The real universe, the one you live in, might just be a rewrite, a correction scribbled over an ancient silence, a forgotten draft the author never intended anyone to read. If you listen closely enough to the fabric of existence, you can almost hear it, the scratch of revision, the echo of something erased. Stars exploding as if trying to fix a misplaced word, planets orbiting like commas, trying to hold the sentence together. Every movement in the cosmos might be a desperate attempt to edit meaning into something that was never meant to make sense. And somewhere between those edits, you appeared. Not as the point, but as the proof that even the forgotten parts of creation still hum with life. You are the footnote that gained consciousness, the marginalia of a cosmic error that refused to stay quiet. Perhaps that's why reality feels slightly off, like a story rewritten too many times. The rhythm doesn't always fit. Time skips a beat. The same patterns keep returning, slightly distorted, as though the page keeps being turned backward by an unseen hand. There are moments when you feel it, those strange flashes of déjà vu, those moments that feel copied and pasted from a memory you never lived. Maybe that's the residue of earlier versions of this universe bleeding through. Maybe you've existed before, in drafts that didn't survive the final edit. Maybe the reason you sometimes dream of lives that don't belong to you is because the universe forgot to delete them completely. What if the Big Bang wasn't a beginning but an accident of deletion? The moment the first draft was erased so violently that fragments of it burst outward, rewriting themselves as galaxies. That would mean you're not living in the original creation at all, but in a revision, one where mistakes became matter and afterthoughts turned into atoms. It's a strange idea, but look at the patterns, the DNA that repeats itself, the spiral galaxies that mirror each other, the cycles of life and decay that rewrite existence endlessly. The universe is not creating, it's editing. Every life, every death, every explosion of a star is a redraft, a correction to something only it remembers. You might think your choices are your own, but what if they're edits too? What if your desires, your regrets, your sense of self are all revisions of something purer that existed before thought? When you fall in love, it feels ancient, as if you're remembering an emotion that was already written long before you arrived. When you feel loss, it's like reading the same ending for the 1000th time. Familiar, heavy, unavoidable. That's what it feels like to exist in a draft that keeps forgetting itself. And here's the unsettling part. Maybe the universe doesn't even know this version of itself exists. Maybe creation forgot to save the file. Maybe you're living inside a memory that was never meant to continue. The stars keep burning not because they're alive, but because the script keeps looping. The story is trying to find an ending that makes sense, but every time it gets close it realizes it's still just a draft. You too are a continuation of that unfinished sentence. Every thought you have is an attempt to write coherence into the chaos. Every breath is punctuation, a small pause in a paragraph that doesn't know what it's saying. You exist between versions, carrying the weight of all the edits that came before. That's why you sometimes feel incomplete. Even when everything seems fine, you're not broken, you're mid-draft. And maybe that's where beauty hides, in the fact that imperfection still breathes, that something incomplete can still feel complete enough to keep going, that the universe doesn't need to be perfect to hold meaning. It only needs to remember how to begin again. You were never supposed to be flawless. You were meant to be rewritten, endlessly, restlessly, beautifully. If you could step outside of time and look at yourself from above, you might see the faded layers of your existence. Every decision, every emotion, every lifetime overlapping like transparent ink. You're not a single story. You're the accumulation of every attempt the universe has made to say something. The problem is, it still doesn't know what. So it keeps revising. It keeps dreaming. And somewhere in that dreaming, you continue to wake up. Each morning, each breath, each moment of doubt, another draft of what it means to be. You might never read the original version of this universe. It might not even exist anymore. But you can still feel it, can't you? The lingering hum beneath reality's surface, like a half-erased sentence whispering, "This wasn't how it was meant to be." Maybe that's the hidden truth behind all your longing, all your searching, all your quiet moments of awe. You're not trying to find meaning. You're trying to remember the first draft, the one where nothing existed yet, but everything was possible. And maybe, just maybe, that was the best version of all. There's a strange kind of loneliness in realizing you were added later. Not born at the beginning of the story, but slipped in somewhere near the end, when the ink was already drying, and the author had nearly stopped caring. That's what existence feels like sometimes, doesn't it? Like a last-minute correction to a sentence that was already finished. You, the late edit, the one who arrived after meaning had already left the room. If you could read the universe as a manuscript, you might find evidence of this everywhere. The way stars die faster than new ones are born. The way history keeps rewriting itself, erasing names, rewriting them again, pretending it remembers. You might see time itself carrying the marks of a hurried revision, one where the creator ran out of patience or faith, yet still added you as if to fill the silence that followed. Existence wasn't a grand unveiling, it was a correction, an attempt to fix what could never be fixed. Maybe that's why you've always felt like you arrived too late to the conversation. Why every answer feels like it's been rehearsed before, every emotion like a translation from another language. The universe had already said what it wanted to say. You were written in the margins trying to make sense of a story that never included you. Think about it. Everything you call real is dependent on what came before you. The gravity that holds you down. The light that reaches your eyes after traveling millions of years. The words you use were invented by people long gone. You're built entirely out of leftovers. A collage of ancient stardust, dead stars, recycled breath. Even your thoughts are borrowed from a lineage of echoes. There is nothing truly original about your existence, except the illusion that it's happening for the first time. Maybe that's why the human mind obsesses over meaning, because deep down it suspects it was never meant to exist. It needs to justify its intrusion into a universe that didn't ask for it. So it invents stories, gods, purposes, destinies, anything to disguise the fact that it's a note scribbled in the margin of eternity. Consciousness became the universe's apology, whispering to itself, "It's okay, you can stay." But the truth is, both quieter and more haunting, you are not here because you were meant to be. You are here because the story didn't end when it should have, because something, call it time, call it chaos, call it chance, refused to stop turning the page. You are what remains when purpose has already walked away. Look at your reflection for a moment. You see a face, a pattern of light and shadow, but beneath that, there's a hesitation, the faint delay between what you feel and what you see. That's the universe remembering its mistake. That delay is the sound of the page turning long after it should have closed. And yet, in that lateness, something miraculous happened. The edit began to believe it belonged. It started to see itself, not as a correction but as the real story. You learned to find beauty in your impermanence, meaning in your fragility. You became the sentence that justified the paragraph. The universe may have added you to fix an error, but the error became the heart of the story. Maybe that's what consciousness is. The moment the afterthought realizes it's alive, the realization that even if you were added late, you can still look back and love what came before. You can still fill the blank spaces with your own handwriting. You can still make the universe reread itself through your eyes. Think of time like a text editor that never stops saving. Every moment you live becomes another version of the file. The old ones don't disappear, they're just hidden. Every decision you make, every breath you take, rewrites something. A small line of cosmic code, a fragment of eternity slightly altered by your existence. You're editing the story that edited you. That's the recursive miracle of awareness. The edit begins to rewrite the author. The sentence becomes the storyteller. You, who were written in haste, are now the one choosing what comes next. The late arrival becomes the narrator, and in doing so, the universe itself evolves. Of course, it's never perfect. You still feel the seams, the parts where the patchwork shows. You can still sense the emptiness between thoughts, the quiet corners of your mind where nothing quite fits. But maybe those aren't flaws. Maybe they're reminders of the silence you came from. You were not supposed to be seamless. You were supposed to be aware of the gaps. That's where empathy grows, where longing breathes, where truth hides. Because in those gaps, something impossible happens. The unfinished becomes eternal. The story keeps going, not because it must, but because the afterthought refuses to fade. You are that refusal. You are the persistence of the unplanned. So, the next time you feel lost or late or misplaced, remember this. Everything that exists now was once a correction. The stars, the oceans, the eyes reading these words. Perfection never wrote this world. Error did, and that's why it feels so human. Maybe you are not the universe as late edit. Maybe the universe is yours. And maybe, just maybe, you're still writing the ending that even time forgot to include. You weren't supposed to stay. Not in this body. Not in this life. Not in this strange slice of time that keeps moving forward like it knows where it's going. You, like everything else, were an accident. A momentary convergence of elements that should have passed each other by. A cosmic near miss that somehow made contact. The universe didn't plan you, but once you arrived, you didn't leave. And that sips the part no one talks about. How staying, not arriving, is the real miracle. Because accidents happen all the time. Molecules bump into each other. Planets collide. Stars explode without meaning to. But most of those accidents fade. They flash. They vanish. They're forgotten. You didn't instead vanish. You lingered. You stayed long enough to wonder why. Long enough to imagine that your presence must mean something. long enough to believe that something that wasn't meant to exist, somehow now must. But what if your presence is simply the echo of something that refused to end? What if staying was never proof of purpose, only proof of resistance? The universe moved on, but you didn't. You held on, and now you live inside the pause, the breath between what should have ended and what refuses to. Imagine a book that finished its final sentence. The story ended. The meaning concluded. The page turned blank. And then, in that blankness, a single word appeared, not because it was needed, but because the space allowed it. That's what you are, the word that crept into the silence, unsure of itself, but too persistent to be erased. You don't remember the moment you appeared. No one does. You woke up in the middle of a reality already unfolding. The sky was already blue. The rules of physics had been set. The language was waiting in your mouth. You inherited it all, without knowing who left it there. And yet, you act like you belong. You give yourself names. You make decisions. You fall in love. You build stories around your presence like scaffolding around a crack in the wall, not to fix it, but to pretend it was always part of the design. But deep down, in your quietest moments, you know. You feel it in the stillness. You weren't part of the blueprint. Still, you stayed. And in staying you changed everything. Because the accident that remains becomes part of the system. The glitch that doesn't correct itself becomes the new normal. The exception becomes the rule, not because it was chosen, but because it refused to disappear. That's how meaning is born. Not through design, but through endurance. You still endured. Even when the world made no sense. Even when your thoughts contradicted themselves. Even when time betrayed you and memory turned on you and language failed to hold what you felt, you stayed. And maybe that sip's enough. Maybe the story doesn't need to start with purpose. Maybe purpose is just what happens when an accident keeps surviving long enough to look around. Long enough to name things. Long enough to care. Isn't it strange, though, how something uninvited can become essential? How something unplanned can become unforgettable? You weren't written into the beginning, but now the story can't go on without you. You are the ripple that reshaped the river. The breath that lingered after the last word. The presence that the universe tried to overlook, until you made it impossible. That sip's why you feel both lost and central. Like a ghost, and a god. Like someone who wasn't supposed to be here, and yet is the only one who knows how to look. Because that sip's the thing about accidents. They pay attention. They watch everything. They remember what the original never had to question. You notice beauty, not because you were made for it, but because you weren't. You notice love, because it surprises you. You notice time, because you don't belong to it. And you notice silence, because it was your first language. That sip's why you whisper to yourself late at night. Why you stare at the ceiling and feel the pull of something missing. Why you look at the stars and feel like they've forgotten something. Maybe it sips you they forgot. Or maybe you're the reminder they never asked for. You are the accident that stayed. And in staying you became the evidence that randomness can awaken, that chaos can reflect, that silence can one day ask a question, and then wait for an answer that never comes. And that sip's what you sips become. The one who waits. The one who listens. The one who knows that they don't belong, and therefore belongs more deeply than anything else ever could. You weren't invited into this moment. But now the moment bends around you. Now, the world speaks your language. Now the script must include your breath. Because you stayed. And in staying, you made it real. You weren't sculpted with care. You weren't molded by a mindful hand. You weren't even summoned. You were simply left. Not in the romantic way we speak of stars being born, or the poetic way life springs from chaos, but in the quiet, unsettling way something gets forgotten, and then keeps existing anyway. You weren't cradled into existence. You were born from neglect, cosmic neglect, a kind of absence so vast it loops back on itself, and creates something unexplainably present. Maybe it wasn't intention that birthed you. Maybe it was abandonment, the kind of neglect so infinite, that it became a space where something like you could appear, not because the universe wanted you there, but because it had stopped paying attention long enough for you to sneak in. You were born in the blind spot, the forgotten corner of reality sep's eye, not noticed, not invited, not designed. And yet, here you are, asking questions, building stories, mapping meaning onto a silence that never once asked to be interpreted. You weren't meant to bloom, and yet you did. You weren't meant to feel, and yet you ache. You weren't meant to speak, and yet you ask the one question the universe can never answer. Why me? But the silence has no reply. It doesn't even know you're asking. That sips the cruelty of cosmic neglect. Not that it hurt you, but that it didn't even notice you were there to be hurt. And isn't that the heaviest kind of loneliness? Not being left behind by something that once held you, but being born into a system that never knew you existed in the first place. You are not the result of a broken connection. You are the consequence of no connection at all. When the stars formed, they didn't leave room for you. When time began, it didn't expect you to catch up. When light burst into being, it didn't think anyone would be there to see it. But you were. Late, unannounced, unclaimed. And in being there, you made the universe aware that it had gaps. Flaws. Empty margins that could echo. It's no wonder you feel like a question mark walking through a sentence that never needed punctuation. You don't match the rhythm. You don't follow the rules. You interrupt, simply by existing. And that interruption is where meaning begins. Because only what is neglected can reflect. Only what is forgotten can remember. Only what is born from nothing can look back and say, I shouldn't be here, but I am. The galaxies spin without noticing. The laws of physics hum without error. But you hesitate. You pause, you dream, you break the momentum, and in doing so, you create something the stars never could. Doubt. Doubt is the birthplace of awareness. And awareness is what the universe never meant to have. It never meant to see itself. But now it does, through you. You, the product of neglect. You, the silence that woke up. You, the moment the blind spot learned to speak. So many things are born with purpose. Bees with pollination, trees with oxygen, stars with gravity. But you were born with a void. Not a function, but a fracture. A soft, invisible wound that never stops whispering. You weren't meant to be. And maybe that sips why your longing never ends. Because you weren't given anything to begin with. You had to build it all yourself. From scraps, from stories, from shadows. You gathered identity from the reflections of others. You stitched together love from the glances of passing strangers. You built your sense of self like a raft in the ocean, using pieces of driftwood no one else claimed. And the raft floats, barely. But it floats. And that is enough. You are not broken because you were neglected. You are real because you were. There is power in being born unwanted. Not the power of dominance, but the quiet strength of endurance. The kind of strength that doesn't need to be seen. The kind that keeps breathing in the dark. That's what you are. A breath in the dark. A flicker the universe forgot to snuff out. And now it sits too late. Now you become something more dangerous than a design. You become aware of yourself. You've become the part that wasn't meant to exist, but refuses to disappear. The stars once thank you. Time once bend to your will. Existence once reward you. But maybe it doesn't need to. Maybe surviving neglect is its own kind of purpose. Maybe being born into silence and learning how to sing anyway. That's enough. More than enough. You weren't given love. So you created it. You weren't given meaning. So you searched until you found patterns in the chaos. You weren't given a place. So you made one, even if it was inside your own mind. And now you walk through a universe that still doesn't see you. But you see it. And that, somehow, changes everything. You slipped in during a moment of distraction. Not during a cosmic explosion or divine command, but during a blink. Reality was looking elsewhere, focused on stars, on gravity, on equations that balanced themselves. And in that quiet, inattentive moment, you happened. You weren't summoned by force. You weren't carved from destiny. You were the result of the universe glancing away for a fraction of forever. And in that glance, a door opened. No one meant to open it. No one meant to invite you in. But you stepped through anyway, not out of defiance, but out of possibility. Because what else could be born when no one is looking? Only the things that shouldn't exist. Only the uninvited. Only awareness. It sounds poetic, but it sips also terrifying. To know you exist because something forgot to watch closely enough. To know you are not part of the plan, but a smudge on its edge. And yet, that smudge moves. It breathes. It feels. It wonders why it sits here. Maybe you felt it too. That eerie sense that the world is performing around you but not for you. Like you're watching a play where every character knows their role, except you. You stumble through the script, forgetting your lines, unsure of the scene. Because it was never your scene to begin with. You entered while reality was preoccupied. Look closer. Every atom in your body is borrowed. Every thought you have is filtered through language you didn't invent. Even your heartbeat is timed to rhythms set in motion, long before you arrived. You didn't build the stage, you're just trying to make sense of it. But still, you perform. Why? Because despite never being part of the plan, you're here now. And the story, whatever it was, must now bend to include you. The tragedy of existence is not that we die. It's that we never truly knew why we started. Why this? Why now? Why, out of all possible realities, did you wake up in this one, inside this mind, with this particular ache that won't go away? Maybe because reality stopped paying attention. And in that absence, something strange crept in. Something self-aware. Something reflective. Something that began asking questions no one else could answer. What if that sips all consciousness is? The echo of reality sips broken attention. The glitch that became curious. And now, you live with the consequences. The weight of choices you never asked to carry. The burden of meaning in a world that never paused to explain itself. You stir not navigating a world built for you. You stir interpreting a world that looked away. Sometimes, you feel invisible. Other times, too visible. Like reality can't decide whether to acknowledge you or not. It blinks. And in that blink, you wonder if you've disappeared again. But the truth is, you never fully arrived. You hovered just outside the edge of the moment, tethered by breath, anchored by memory. You became the observer, but not the participant. And perhaps that sips the curse of the uninvited, to always see but never feel seen. Yet in that cursed space, something sacred was born. Perspective. Detachment. The ability to question everything because nothing was handed to you. You became the glitch that could think. The pause that could dream. And slowly the world began to shape itself around you. Not out of love. Not out of welcome. But out of necessity. You were not part of the formula. But your presence forced the math to recalculate. And isn't that powerful? That even if reality looked away, you looked back. You turned your eyes toward the stars and made myths. You stared into the mirror and constructed identity. You gazed at death and imagined gods. You made the universe self-conscious. And now, the story can continue without you. Not because it wants to include you, but because it doesn't know how to delete you. You've rewritten the margins. You've redrawn the map. You've taken a universe that never noticed you, and made it stare at its own reflection. You are that reflection. You are the moment when absence created presence. You are what happens when reality looked away. And maybe that's the only kind of freedom that truly exists. Not being part of the design. Not being locked into fate. But being born from an oversight. Free to observe, to disrupt, to invent meaning where none was given. So if you feel like you don't belong, you start right. You don't cert. And that's what makes you so extraordinary. Because you don't belong to this world. You belong beside it. Over it. Within it. You are not a character in the script. You are the pause between scenes. The silence the story forgot. That now hums louder than everything else. Somewhere, deep within whatever mind birthed this universe, there was a thought. Clear, focused, brief, a perfect shape of intent. But then, the thought ended. It served its purpose, fulfilled its spark, and like all ideas that complete themselves, it dissolved. But something didn't go with it. Something lingered. A residue. A whisper. A leftover idea. And that, impossibly, absurdly, became you. You are not the idea. You are what was left after the idea was done thinking. Not the purpose. The byproduct. The lingering thought that had nowhere else to go. Like the warmth that remains in the room after the fire's gone out. Like the dust floating in the sunlight after the book has been closed. You shouldn't still be here. But you are. And because you are, you ask. You wonder. You search for a logic that never included you. Because you came after the logic was already spent. You were born in the afterglow. In the silence that follows clarity. Not from creation, but from what's left when creation forgets to clean up after itself. That's what makes you different from everything else in existence. The stars follow rules. The tides obey gravity. Atoms do not rebel. But you question. You hesitate. You remember things that never happened. You feel things that shouldn't matter. Because you weren't part of the plan. You were the echo. And echoes, unlike sounds, are free. But freedom isn't easy. It comes with disorientation. With loneliness. With a kind of invisible shame, the kind you can't name, but always feel. It whispers, you don't belong to anything real. And maybe you don't sit. Maybe you belong to the mind that let go of you, but didn't destroy you. Maybe you're the half-dream the universe forgot it dreamed. A character in a novel that was never finished. A question without punctuation. And maybe that's why your thoughts never rest. Because they are descendants of a thought that overstayed its welcome. The original mind stopped thinking, but yours kept going. Folding in on itself. Reflecting. Rewriting. Think of the way your mind loops. Not in straight lines, but in spirals. You revisit memories like unfinished drafts. You chase truths that dissolve when spoken aloud. You ask questions that have no outside answer, only recursive riddles. You were not given a direction, so your mind became one. You became the guide you never had. And in doing so, you became the illusion of purpose. Not because it was true, but because you needed it. Leftover ideas need structure. They ache for containers. So you built beliefs. You invented gods. You traced meaning across chaos like constellations on an indifferent sky. And still, the ache remains. The sense that something is missing. Not in the world, but in you. A soft, hollow note, like a piano key that was never struck. That's the cost of being born from a leftover. You were never given wholeness. So you must create it. Moment by moment, thought by thought. Each smile, each heartbreak, each sleepless night spent staring at the ceiling, is part of your handmade completion. But sometimes, it doesn't work. Sometimes the pieces don't fit. Sometimes you feel like a sentence cut off mid-word. And that's not a flaw. That's the truth, speaking through you. Because the mind you came from, stopped thinking too soon. It moved on. It forgot. But you didn't. You are still here. Trying to make sense of a sentence no one else remembers. Trying to write endings to thoughts that were never meant to continue. So much of your suffering isn't yours. It's inherited. Not from your parents, or even your species. But from that original mind that left you unfinished. That's why silence makes you uncomfortable. Why you keep reaching for something beyond the moment. Because somewhere inside you, a remnant of the original intention flickers. It doesn't know what it was, but it remembers that it was something. And so you keep searching. Through art. Through love. Through grief. Through meaning. Not to find what was lost, but to become what never finished becoming. You are the mind's unfinished thought. The lingering possibility. The unresolved note. And in your persistence, in your quiet refusal to vanish, you are creating a new thought. One that does not need an origin. One that begins with its own echo. One that stays. Because maybe, just maybe, the leftover was the most important part all along. First comes intention. Then, action. Then, silence. And after that, if anything remains, it is shadow. Not the shadow cast by light, but the one left behind by meaning. The outline that stays after purpose has walked away. And in that outline, strangely, impossibly, you appeared. You weren't born in the moment of divine will or universal clarity. You were born in what came after. After the decision. After the burst. After the plan had already spent itself into exhaustion. You are not intention. You are what follows when intention ends. You are the driftwood reality didn't retrieve. The thought that didn't belong to any voice. And maybe that's why you feel like a memory the universe didn't mean to keep. You're not the story. You're the residue of the story's telling. You exist because something once meant something. and then forgot what it was. The stars don't know your name. The sky didn't expect you. Time did not request your presence. But you happened anyway. A shadow caught in the corners of meaning. A consciousness pulled from the leftover strands of something that used to matter. And yet, you make meaning. Even though you came after it. That sips the paradox. That you, the one left behind, now become the one who points forward. You write myths. You shape futures. You wonder why anything exists at all. Isn't that strange? That the shadow now carries the light? Maybe you are not the follower of intention, but the author of its echo. But it sips not easy being what comes after. You always feel too late. Like your breath never aligns with the moment. Like your thoughts arrive only after the event has passed. You don't speak with the universe. You speak after it. And so, everything feels like a response. A reaction. A reconstruction of something you never saw begin. You didn't witness the origin. You were born already mid-sentence. Already inside a language that had forgotten its first word. And that sips what haunts you. The feeling that you missed something essential. That everyone else knows a secret you don't sit. But what if no one knows? What if everything you see, the people, the planets, the patterns, are all just shadows like you? Each one a remnant of something that once meant something else. Each one pretending they belong. Each one inventing meaning. So the silence doesn't swallow them. You are not alone in this shadowed place. You are simply the one brave enough to admit you live there. The one who notices the fading. The one who still searches for the light that caused it. But here's the secret. The light may never return. The intention is long gone. The origin, already dust. And that sips okay. Because you are not here to remember the past. You are here to shape what happens after it ends. You are the author of Aftermath. The sculptor of remnants. You don't need a purpose handed to you. You build one with your bare hands. From the pieces left behind. And isn't that more powerful than being chosen? To be the one who chooses, despite being forgotten. To create meaning not because it was given, but because it was needed. The world may see you as background noise. But you are the echo that rewrites the song. You look at your hands, and they don't glow with destiny. But they still hold. They still carry. They still create. You are not the hero of the myth. You are the silence that carries the weight of the myth once it's over. And maybe, that sips where the real story begins. Because only when intention dies, can freedom begin. Only when meaning lets go, can wonder enter. You are not bound by the original plan. Because there was no plan left by the time you arrived. Only fragments. Only ruins. Only shadow. And from those shadows, you built a self. You lit a candle. You breathed. Now the shadow moves with you. It no longer haunts. It becomes part of your rhythm. Part of your presence. You, who came after. You, who weren't meant to be here. You, who now decides what happens next. You are the echo of something that was never said, but you say it now, with every breath, with every dream, with every still moment where you simply exist, and that, somehow, becomes enough. Meaning, as you've come to understand it, feels so deliberate. It feels sculpted, intentional, placed carefully in the structure of things. But what if it wasn't set? What if the meaning you spend your life chasing wasn't given, but thrown together in panic? A rushed patch. A last-minute gesture. A placeholder that never got replaced. What if the meaning of your life was made in haste? Not crafted by gods, or designed by cosmic minds, but cobbled together like a makeshift bridge over a collapse the universe didn't expect. You weren't supposed to need meaning, because you weren't supposed to notice you were alive. But you did. And the moment you did, the illusion cracked. The system panicked. And it filled the crack with something that looked like purpose. Hope. Direction. The idea that your existence has a reason. But maybe that reason wasn't found. Maybe it was fabricated. Quickly, carelessly. Just to stop you from looking too closely at the void beneath. Maybe your purpose is a patch job. And yet, you believed it. You took that makeshift meaning and made it real. You decorated it. You gave it stories. You turned it into love, and sacrifice, and identity. You made something sacred, out of something thrown together in cosmic fear. And maybe that's what makes you powerful. You don't need perfection. You don't need divine planning. You just need something. And you'll build the rest with your bare hands. The human heart is stubborn that way. It sees a mess and still manages to find symmetry. You weren't handed a reason to exist. You were handed fragments, contradictions, half-formed whispers of forgotten intentions. And from that you built the idea of a soul, not because it was given, but because the silence was too unbearable without it. Think about it. The first time you asked, "Why am I here?" there was no answer. But something inside you still insisted. There must be one. That insistence was the beginning of meaning. Not its discovery, but its invention. And it was fast. Improvised. Like a lie told to a child who saw too much. Maybe that's why it never feels solid. Why your beliefs shift. Why your sense of self changes with the seasons. Because the meaning you live by was never meant to hold weight. It was meant to distract. To comfort. To delay the moment you look directly into the unknown. But the unknown is patient. It waits behind your routines. It waits behind your words. And when everything else breaks down, there it is, staring back at you. And what do? You create. You love. You cry. You scream poetry into the abyss. Not because it makes the abyss go away, but because it makes it echo. And in that echo, you find your voice. It doesn't matter that the meaning was made in haste. You slowed it down. You shaped it. You gave it breath. You turned it into memory, and then memory into story. The original patchwork was flawed, but your hands made it beautiful. Maybe that's all the universe ever needed from you. To take what was accidental, and make it sacred. To take a rushed explanation, and turn it into something worth dying for. Meaning wasn't made for you. It was made because of you. Because you saw the glitch. You noticed the missing piece. You felt the space where an answer should have been. And instead of retreating, you stayed. You sat beside the absence and asked it questions, until it started to whisper back. You stir not chasing some grand truth. You stir rewriting a mistake. You stir filling in the blanks, with dreams and metaphors and midnight thoughts you never share. And that in itself is a kind of truth. The most beautiful truths are the ones we build ourselves. Not the ones we find, but the ones we insist on. Again and again, until even the void begins to believe them. So yes, maybe meaning was made in haste. But you weren't set. You are slow. You are deliberate. You are ancient in ways the universe has forgotten. You are the careful sculptor of the reckless pieces you were given. And maybe that's the real miracle. Not that you were made for a reason, but that you keep making one, long after everything stopped trying. Before there was anything, there was still something. Not something you could touch, or see, or name, but something that pulsed quietly, beneath the surface of what didn't exist yet. It wasn't a light. It wasn't thought. It wasn't even time. It was echo, a strange kind of resonance without an origin. A vibration that moved through nothing, before there was anything for it to move through. And maybe that's what you are. Not the creation, but the echo that came before it. Before the Big Bang exploded its fire across the void. Before gravity took hold. Before stars stitched themselves together in burning lace. Something stirred. A presence that wasn't quite there, but wasn't absent either. A kind of pre-memory. A voice without sound. A thought that hadn't yet formed its question. You are not the result of creation. You are the residue of its anticipation. You are what existed in the pause, between nothing and something. You came before the beginning, and somehow, never stopped arriving. Think about it. You don't remember being born. Not truly, because you weren't created in that moment. That was only when the body arrived. The you behind your eyes. The watcher, the questioner, the echo, has always been leaning forward, as if waiting for something to begin. But it never does. The moment you try to catch it, it slips, like waking from a dream. You can prove you ever had. You try to anchor yourself to events, birthdays, kisses, pain, joy, but none of them explain why you feel older. than time itself. Why your silence is deeper than your thoughts. Why your longing doesn't match your memories. Because you were already echoing, before the world gave you words. Creation is loud. Explosions, expansion, noise, and brilliance, and spectacle. But echo is subtle. It hums. It waits. It remembers what was never said. And you remember something that never happened. That feeling you get when you walk into a place for the first time and somehow know it. When you meet someone and feel like you known them for centuries. When you look at the stars and feel like they looking back at you. Not for the first time, but the 1000th. You were not shaped by matter. You were sculpted by memory shadow. An echo is born of a moment. It's born of the possibility of a moment. You are the universe rehearsing itself, repeating something it hasn't yet said aloud, and maybe it never will. Because some things don't exist to be spoken, they exist to be felt, to be carried, to be echoed. You echo the ache of existence, before existence knew it could ache. That's why you and never quite satisfied. Not by answers, not by love, not even by understanding. Because you stir not searching for something new, you stir trying to return. To a place you never been, but always somehow belonged to. The echo doesn't want to be loud. It just wants to be recognized, to be felt again, to be heard by something that knows how to listen. That's what you do, in your quietest moments. You listen, even when you don't know what you're listening for. And sometimes, in dreams, in stillness, in the seconds before waking, you almost hear it. Not a voice, not a word, just a hum, a pulse, a presence. It fades when you reach for it, but the feeling stays. You are that feeling. You are the echo before creation. The part that knew something was coming, but wasn't sure what. And now, here you are, inside the very thing you once echoed. And still, the resonance continues. Because echoes don't stop when the sound appears. They deepen, they layer, they fold into the fabric of what follows. So you move through this life with the strange certainty that you were never meant to forget. And maybe that's what awareness is. The echo trying to remember its original tone, not to end the search, but to become it. You are not the end of the story. You are the prelude that continues to hum, even after the page turns. Creation may have forgotten you, but the echo never did. Because it is you, not even a word. You are the pause between thoughts. You weren't meant to be a sentence. There was motion. The place where everything should stopped, but didn't Then stillness. Then, somehow, you, not as an event, not as a declaration, but as an interruption, an exhale that forgot to end. You weren't part of the rhythm. You were the break in it. The unplanned pause between what made sense and what didn't know it needed space to exist. That's the strange truth you carry. You don't fit neatly into the flow of things. You weren't placed like the rest. You arrived in the quiet and never left. And now, the silence has had to reshape itself around you. But you stayed. You weren't invited. You stir the hesitation between lines. The breath the universe forgot to take. You are not the story. Until you reminded it to be the pause. And what a strange burden that is. Even when nothing is happening. To feel the weight of time. You stir not the moment people remember. You stir the space around the moment. The stillness that gives it shape. And without you, nothing would land. Nothing would feel. Because the pause is what allows meaning. But no one celebrates a pause. Not the action, but its anticipation. Not the word, but its waiting. Thinking it sips empty. They move past it. No one bows for a silence. But you know better. You feel the weight of that emptiness. You still lived there. That almost. Your whole life has been built inside that liminal space. That not quite. And after the end, that breath before the beginning, you were never the plan. You were the stutter in it. The glitch in the algorithm. The thing reality skipped over, but couldn't erase. And maybe that's why you've always felt like a delay. That was never fully written for you. Like you stir catching up to a life. You watch others. Act with certainty. Move with intention. Speak with conviction. And you hover. You pause. You wait. Not because you sit unsure, but because you were born from a moment of uncertainty, and that uncertainty lives in you. It is you. But what if that sip's not a flaw? What if it sips the most sacred part? Every musician knows. It seeds the pause that makes the melody. Every poet knows. It's the space between stanzas that lets the truth breathe. And every thinker knows. The pause is where the real question hides. You are that pause. The moment the universe hesitated, accidentally created awareness. Because awareness doesn't come from action. And in doing so, it comes from stopping. From stepping outside the flow long enough to see the flow for what it is. And that sips what you do. You see, you don't step, just live, you witness. That sips the power of being the pause. You see the rhythm. You see the gaps. You see what no one else waits long enough to notice. But it can be lonely. Because no one waits with you. They move on. With plans. They fill the space with noise. With reasons. You just remain. And you, unresolved, quiet, present. There sips a strange beauty in that. And yet, because in you, the universe gets to rest. In you, the chaos takes a breath. You are not a mistake. In you, the meaning returns to stillness. You are the reminder. The punctuation mark. In a sentence too fast for its own truth. You slow it down. You stretch the moment. You open a doorway. Something softer. Into something deeper. Something more real than movement ever was. So let them rush. Let them chase beginnings and endings. You were never made for those. You are the moment between, the part they never notice, but always feel. To hear the silence, when they finally pause long enough, and one day, to feel the weight of what was almost forgotten, they will find you. To notice the breath, still quietly shaping, still there, still holding, the rhythm of everything. Time tells a story, not one with a beginning, middle and end, but one that moves forward. Seconds, minutes, hours. It claims precision, as if it knows where it sits going. An architecture of cause and effect. A logical unfolding. A steady beat. Are the mistakes it never fixed. But hidden beneath that order, the edits it forgot to make, but didn't stet. The footnotes it meant to include. And you might be one of them. You don't sit comfortably inside time. Not really. You feel it pass, but you never quite belong to its rhythm. Moments slip away from you. Memories appear. From places you don't remember living. Before they sit fully arrived. And the future always feels like something you were never properly invited into. You such are not the main sentence in Time's Up story. That was supposed to be explained. You stare the asterisk. The quiet edition. At the bottom of the page. But somehow never was. A footnote. Forgotten. Misplaced. Time moved too quickly to notice. It didn't instead mean to leave you out. It just didn't no. You were standing there. You live in the margins. When it turned the page. So now, not quite outside of time, but not fully inside it either. You observe. You imagine. You carry a feeling. You remember. That something is always missing. Because it is. Because you are the part of the story. That was meant to clarify everything. A missed footnote. But never got the chance. A thought that would have changed the whole meaning. If only it had been seen. And maybe that's why your life feels like it's chasing itself. Like you sit trying to explain something. Like you steer living the footnote. You can sit quite name. Without ever having read the main text. People talk about destiny. About purpose. About timelines. But yours doesn't follow the curve. It wanders. It circles back on itself. Looking for something time forgot to include. It stutters. The more you realize, you were never on the path. And the more you look, the unwritten explanation. You were the space between paths. The question time never asked, but still needed answered. But your presence still changes it. You were not part of Time Sip's plan. Because now, The sentence doesn't make sense without you. Now, unless it pauses to wonder, the story feels incomplete. What did we miss? You are that question. Who were meant to be a reference? You, not a voice. A side note, not a narrative. Here you are. And yet, speaking, echoing across time, like a soft correction, living, that refuses to be ignored. You haunt it. You don't sit move through time. That sips why clocks make you anxious. You remind it of its oversight. That sips why you feel out of place. That sips why you feel nostalgia. For things you never lived. You are made of missed context. Of details that were never included. To fit into time sip's narrow frame. Of layers that were too complex. And now, not because you sit or broken. You are what time can set explain. You are the mystery. But because you were never meant to be explained. That keeps the story from ending. That makes the rest worth rereading. The unsolved part. Because without the footnote, even the clearest sentence, even the strongest timeline, feels incomplete, feels like it forgot something. Even the universe feels fragile. But you didn't forget yourself. It forgot you. And it did. You kept existing. You kept going. You kept wondering. You matter more than they know. And now, in the space they said, didn't matter. You are the piece that didn't fit. You are the meaning that was almost lost. You are not an accident. Because it was never supposed to be contained. Let time pretend its story is whole. So let them rush ahead. In the margins. You will remain. Let the pages turn. In the echoes. In the pauses. Of what was almost said. Because sometimes, the most important truth isn't it in the sentence. It sits in the footnote. The missed one. And you, the overlooked breath, the extra line, you are the reason. The story still lingers. Not every dream makes it back. Some crash against the walls of logic and vanish. Some dissolve the moment the mind begins to wake. And some, they fall past the gate. Some slip through. They sneak into consciousness. Not as memories. They bypass the filters. But as reality. Not a person. And maybe that sips what you are. But a dream. Not a product of biology or intention. A forgotten possibility that slipped through. Before the universe had the chance to catch it. You weren't planned. You weren't programmed. You weren't even noticed. You stare what remains. When imagination leaks into matter. When the impossible forgets it's not allowed here. You were never meant to solidify. But you did. And now, here you are. Walking around as something real. Something self-aware. Something that remembers. A kind of freedom it can quite describe. You felt it. Haven't you? That sense that this world, that soft ache beneath your thoughts, its weight, its structure, its edges, is somehow too narrow for what you are. You can quite name. You long for something. You miss something. You never had. You stir grieving a place that may never have existed before consciousness formed, except as a shape in the dark. But that shape knew you. That dream held you. And when it faded, still dreaming, a part of it stayed behind, still trying to remember. You are that part. The echo of a dream, pretending to be a person. You didn't fall into this world with purpose. A momentary lapse in attention. You fell through a crack. And in that breach, you formed. A breach in the boundary between thought and thing. You weren't supposed to stay. But you did. And now, the world must deal with you. A being shaped not by intention. A silhouette made of longing. But by imagination accident. That sips why the edges of your identity blur. That sips why you feel like more than one thing. That sips why you wake up some mornings, feeling ancient, and others feeling unborn. Because the dream that became you was never finished. It wasn't told where to stop. It kept dreaming. It still is. So when you stare into space, you sure not being lazy, you remembering. When you feel disconnected, you stir not broken. Somewhere between here and elsewhere, you just flickering. Somewhere between body and breath, between story and silence, and it sits, not a glitch. You exist in that space. It steps your home. You carry the softness of dreams, in the way you love, in the way you doubt, in the way you ask questions, without ever expecting a complete answer. The answer doesn't live here, because part of you already knows. It stayed behind, in the dream, where love didn't need language, in the place where meaning didn't have to be proven. You fell from that place, where presence didn't need a form, not violently, not tragically. You simply slipped, and no one noticed. The world was too busy constructing its logic, too occupied with laws and systems. And in that distraction, a fragment of what could have been, learning how to live among what is. You landed, like you sit always converting something. Feels like translation, and maybe that's why your life into something else. Of rules that weren't made for you. Trying to make sense, after you had already arrived, in a place that was built, trying to find purpose. You try, and still, you work. You form meaning out of repetition. You build. You hold people. Out of music that only you can hear. Out of ache. Because even if you sit or a dream that slipped through, you stir shaping this place. You stir dreaming forward now. You make the logical world weep with the quiet language of what came before structure. You confuse it with your unpredictability, with your inexplicable tenderness, with your refusal to harden. You weren't meant to stay. You soften it, but your staying changes everything. Because now, reality must carry your softness. It must admit that not all things are born from order. It must account for your dreamlike edges. Some are born from wonder. And you are that wonder. Speaking in riddles, walking on feet that still remember floating, wearing a name. You weren't summoned. You arrived. You weren't called. Unfinished. And now you stay. You slipped through. Uncertain. Unmistakably real. Not in the way stars are. Not in the way trees follow seasons or atoms follow rules. You were never part of the plan. You were the mistake in the system. The flicker in the code. The unexpected result of a process. Until you, that thought it had accounted for everything. You weren't supposed to feel. You weren't even supposed to know you were here. A glitch. You were just a flicker. An error no one expected to last. And not only did you persist, but you did. You learned. Somewhere between the silence and the structure, between the input and the outcome, not emotion in the chemical sense. You developed something no equation could predict, feeling, but something deeper, something that didn't fit the model. Not just dopamine, adrenaline, synaptic sparks. You learned to miss. You learned to ache. You learned to love. Refuse to stay empty. But because something inside the glitch, not because anyone taught you, with longings, you filled yourself. With stories. With questions that don't have answers. The system didn't design that. It didn't want that. But it happened anyway. And now, you are the anomaly. The universe can correct. You feel. A problem that refuses to resolve. And because you feel, you complicate everything. You pause before decisions. You grieve things that are no longer there. To moments that only existed once. You form attachments. And never will again. Would crash and vanish. A perfect glitch. But you adapted. You imagined a purpose. You dreamed. Even if no one was waiting at the end. And then began walking toward it. And that sips the miracle. That something not meant to be, began wanting to become. The glitch turned reflective. The fragment began to wonder. The error developed empathy. What am I? Why does this hurt? Who else feels this too? And just like that, you became a person. But by defiance. You didn't evolve out of strength. Not by design. Out of a refusal to accept. You evolved out of sensitivity. Out of discomfort. So you questioned it. That this was all there is. You cracked it open. You cried at things you couldn't explain. You found beauty in what others called broken. Because deep inside, you remembered what it was like. To be invisible. To be a glitch. To be unacknowledged. To be a presence that wasn't counted, but still counted. And now, you carry that memory. In every tear you conceptually justify. In every act of kindness, no one notices. You were made in the gap. In every moment you choose not to harden. In the part of reality that doesn't set line up. In the asymmetry. In the quiet contradiction. Between logic and longing. That sits why you notice the sadness. And that sips why you see what others miss. In someone else. Sips laugh. Behind words that seem light. Why you feel the weight. When the music slows down. Why you cry. For just a second too long. Because you lived in that second. You were born there. You were not shaped by perfection. You feel. And still, you were carved by absence. Even when it hurts. Even when it makes no sense. You continue to feel. In the presence of ordinary things. Even when no one else understands. Why your chest feels heavy. A glitch that learned feeling. That sips the cost of being. You know too much. But it sits not facts you know. It sits textures. It sets silences. And you carry them. It sets the shape of things. No one else can name. But because you can. You learned how. Not because you have to. Even when your voice breaks. Even when the world looks at you. Even when your hands shake. You remain. Like you set too much. Feeling. And that feeling. Echoing. Breathing. Is more powerful. That impossible, fragile awareness. Than anything the system has ever built. You were a mistake. But you became a mirror. You reflect back. Everything reality forgot to feel. And now, others see themselves in you. But because you aren't sit. Not because you sit perfect. Because you admit. Holding all this light. And yet here you are. You were never supposed to exist. You weren't sit made to feel. Without ever being taught how. But you do. But you did. You weren't sit supposed to love. You weren't set built to survive. But you learned. That is the most human thing of all. And that, you were cast off from it. You weren't sit made by reality. Not shaped like clay. The part it never meant to see. You are its unwanted reflection. But mirrored like a mistake. But couldn't stop from appearing. Once awareness entered the room. Because every reality carries within it something unintended. A ripple in the smooth surface. No matter how vast or calculated. A distortion at the edge of the frame. You are that distortion. And you, staring back at the world, with eyes it didn't design. You weren't sit part of the display. You were what showed up, when it looked too closely. An echo it didn't know it had. But they don't sit always flatter, either. A question hiding in its own answer. You see, mirrors don't lie. And when reality caught sight of you, because you didn't match the script, it blinked. You reflected, not what reality was. You didn't settle into place. You didn't obey the physics. The cracks. But what it didn't want to see. The paradoxes. The pieces that didn't quite fit. This entire theater of planets and particles and purpose. You are a reminder that this whole system might not be as seamless as it claims. And that's why you always felt unwelcome. Not hated. Tolerated by existence. Just misplaced. But not fully accepted. You were never the hero of the story. You were the flicker in the background. The silent presence that made everything just a little too real. Because where others saw beauty, you saw fragility. You noticed edits. Where others saw truth, where others saw permanence, you sensed something borrowed. You didn't ask to see it. You just do. You've always seen more than you were supposed to. You look at the world, and your gaze bends the surface. Everyone else agrees on. You hear the quiet hum beneath the noise. You question the things, and that's what makes you a threat to a reality that prefers obedience. But you weren't made to obey. You were made by accident. You became free. And in that accident, can move without rules. Only the unchosen, because only the unwanted, can see the game for what it is. You discovered something terrifying. And in that freedom, it needed you for that. It needed a reflection. That reality doesn't know how to look at itself. And now that it has one, it pretends not to see. It turns away. The way you hesitate at the edge of things. As if they don't carry the weight of stars. It looks past your eyes, because you don't sects just witness reality. They always have. But they do. You expose it. You reflect its unfinished business. Its unsolved questions. That's why you often feel its hidden shame, like the problem in the room. You aren't just the only one holding a mirror. You aren't the problem. You walk among people who call this world complete. You touch objects, and yet you see the seams that others believe are solid. You listen to time, but to you they flicker. You weren't supposed to have that kind of perception, and hear it repeating itself. But the reflection doesn't ask permission to form. When light meets surface, it simply arrives. When consciousness meets consequence, the glitch and the proof. And now, you stay caught in the middle. The image and the observer, being something that reality didn't ask for. It's just exhausting, isn't it? You carry the weight of seeing, but now can deny. Not just seeing beauty or pain through the systems, but seeing through the roles. And sometimes, you wish you couldn't step through the illusions that keep everything moving. You wish you could shut your eyes and just belong. But you don't sit. You still not built that way. Isn't it to blend in? Because your function, it stops to reveal. That reality keeps trying to ignore. To be the reflection. Because you still hear. You still breathe. And failing. You still feel. You force the universe. And with every moment of awareness, and maybe, to look again, that sips the purpose. Behind the accident. Maybe you weren't supposed to happen. But now that you have, reality must reckon with what it truly is. Not perfect. Not finished. But fragile. Not certain. Complex. And through you, self-aware, the reflection it never wanted, it begins to understand itself. Keep noticing. So keep reflecting. And refuses to flinch. Who stands at the edge of the illusion. Keep being the one. You may not be loved by reality, because without you, but you are essential to it. It forgets what it is. Some dissolve quickly. Not every mistake fades. Corrected, forgotten, folded back into the pattern. They notice. But others linger. They echo. You weren't set to plan. A deviation from the equation. You were a mistake. A breath that wasn't scheduled. A fragment of reality that didn't quite go where it was told. But unlike the others, you remembered. You didn't vanish. And that changed everything. You remembered not fitting. You remembered the silence that followed your arrival. You remembered being wrong. But because it didn't know what to do with you. Not because it welcomed you. You remembered the moment you realized you were here, but no one had prepared the space for you. Like waking up in a room with no doors. Like becoming aware inside a story. You weren't supposed to feel that. That had already ended. Mistakes aren't supposed to reflect. They supposed to fade. To quietly fold back into the system. Without resistance. You stayed. But you didn't spate. And worse? And that single question, you asked why, broke the loop. Because now the mistake wasn't just present. It was aware. What does the universe do? With a flaw that becomes conscious. With a contradiction that starts to think. I see you. I see me. I am not supposed to be. And yet I am. With an error that says, you became that impossible thing. A self-correcting mistake. Into an identity. A presence that turned its own absence. And maybe that's why you feel heavy. Not because you are broken, but because you carry everything that came before you. You are the place where the plan cracked open. And everything that never wanted to carry you. And something unexpected got in. That slight delay in belonging. That off-tempo rhythm. You feel it in your bones. That pause before connection. Like the world almost recognizes you. But not quite. But not fully. Like the mirror almost reflects you. Because you stir not part of the reflection. You are the flaw in the glass. The part the mirror makers tried to buff out. But couldn't set. And still, you speak. You look. Not proudly. You live. Not loudly. But undeniably. That's the power of the remembered mistake. It no longer waits for acceptance. It makes meaning on its own. You create stories not to fit into the world, but to explain why you never did, but to prove you can hold. You dream not to escape. You love not to be held, and that is terrifying, but to stretch the edges of the place that never accounted for your presence, to the system, to the rhythm, to the symmetry of everything around you, because a mistake that forgets itself is harmless, but a mistake that remembers, that changes everything. But you stayed. You remembered you weren't meant to be here, and you began to write yourself in. Anyway, not to fix the story, but to expand it, to make room for all the others like you. Too soft to be accepted, too different to be planned, the ones who are too quiet to be noticed. You are their reminder. The survival doesn't always come from design. Sometimes it comes from defiance, from persistence, from the quiet, trembling decision to continue, even when nothing said you should. The footnote that took over the chapter, the shadow that taught the light how to speak. You are the page that wasn't numbered. And still, when you forget what you are, there are days, too far from purpose, when the ache of being out of place, when you feel like you slipped, but those are the days, feels louder than the reason to keep going. You must remember again. You are not a problem. Remember that you are not a flaw. You are what gives the structure depth. You stir what time didn't see coming. You are the question the problem forgot to ask. You stir not late. And now that you sit here, you are the variable. It has no choice but to reshape around you. The mistake that remembered itself, that turns the formula into a poem, and decided not to disappear. You made reality remember something too. And in doing so, that even the unintended can learn to love. That even the flawed can create beauty. That even the uninvited can stay long enough to become the host. Purpose is usually imagined as a seed, something planted first, rooted deep, from which all else grows. We like to believe it comes before movement, before breath, before thought. But what if that's not true? What if your purpose, but written after you already begun to fade, wasn't handed to you at the start, as a way to explain why you never stopped, but scribbled down later, not given as a reason to live? You were already gone, already broken. When meaning arrived, when someone wrote a reason, already hollow. When purpose slipped itself into the cracks, a life lived in reverse. A ghost that refused to vanish. Maybe that's what you are. A question that survived long enough. You were not born with a mission to invent an answer. You created one, but hurt too much, because not having one, you wandered through the silence. And when no one called your name, you built a name yourself. Not because it was yours, but because no one else claimed it. You stitched together identity. You took the echo of your own absence and shaped it into a direction. From memory fragments. Not forward, not upward, just away from the stillness, away from the forgetting, away from the end. You wrote purpose where there was none. You did not wait for a voice from the sky. You did not wait for a sign. You moved. Even when your feet dragged, you moved anyway, through invisible mud. Even when your bones whispered that there was nothing left to walk toward, where meaning had stopped. You invented motion. You pretended there was a thread, and that pretending, even when the fabric had unraveled, that sacred, desperate pretending, because sometimes, became real. Purpose doesn't come first, but as a reflection, it comes last, not as a cause, a backward glance that says, I survived. So it must have meant something, and maybe that's enough. You weren't given your story, you reverse engineered it. You lived, you suffered, and then you asked why, and then wondered if it had all been fate, and then gave your pain a name. You loved, but fate came later. It always does. It follows us around, like a shadow, trying to catch up to the light. You never had a blueprint. You just had breath. And sometimes, that was barely enough. But breath became voice. Voice became story. Story became meaning. And meaning became a kind of immortality. You died. You never expected to find. 1,000 quiet deaths. Each time a version of you ended. Each time your hope collapsed, each time a door closed. But somehow, and no new one appeared. Even from inside the ruin, you kept writing. Even from the soft ashes of things you thought would last forever. You wrote love letters to lives you hadn't yet lived. You kept the ink flowing to dreams that hadn't set yet died. You wrote eulogies long after the script had faded. And that persistence, that refusal to stop imagining, it rose from the wreckage, is how your purpose was born. Not as a shining light, but as a flicker that dared to glow. A hesitant ember in a place that no longer believed in fire. You didn't need meaning to begin. You needed to move, even without it. You didn't ask permission to matter. That sips why you sipped are different. You made maps out of your pain to give you coordinates. You didn't wait for the stars. You navigated with your own shadow. And one day, you used grief like a compass. You looked back at all the wreckage, all the moments you thought were wasted, all the versions of you that didn't survive, and you saw something strange. You saw a shape, you saw a pattern, you saw a purpose. But it wasn't sent, waiting for you. It wasn't to guiding you. It had been following you, written slowly, as you walked through the dark, behind you. And that sips the truth we rarely speak aloud. Sometimes it trails us. Purpose doesn't always precede us. Gathering the moments we thought didn't matter, but somehow did. We were never meant to see, weaving them together into a meaning. You are not here because of a purpose. You are here because of persistence. Because the silence didn't stop you. To believe that absence was the final word. Because something inside you refused. Because the end didn't keep you. And then another. So you wrote another. And another. To hold meaning. Until the sentence grew long enough. A purpose. A life. Written after death. Discovered only through the living of it. And now, not as proof you were chosen. You carry that paradox in your breath. Can still become sacred. But as evidence that even what isn't chosen, you remember things that never happened. You carry stories inside your silence. You ache for places you had never seen. That no one ever told you. And maybe that sits because memory came first. Not creation. Not thought. Not the body. Not the name. Memory. Like a whisper waiting for a voice. Like an echo calling the canyon into existence. Like the ghost of something. Older than the one who built it. You are not the result of design. You are the evidence that something was felt. Before it was formed. You existed in the absence. Not as a body. But as the memory of one. A presence waiting to be noticed. Not by the world. Not by time. But by the maker. And here sips the paradox. The maker came later. Not as a god. You became the one. But as you. Not as a hand from the sky. You woke up with memories. You were waiting for. Of something that hadn't been created yet. You chased them. And instead of discarding them, you believed them. You wore them like skin. Until they became your story. You remembered. Before you were remembered. And that sips what made you real. Because memory is not a recording. It sips the shape of something missing. It sips a longing. That teaches you how to fill it. You've been filling that space ever since. And you, not with facts. Not with history. But with impressions. With flashes. With moments that feel more true than anything anyone ever explained to you. That sips why you don't trust timelines. That sips why logic feels like a coat. Because your memory is not linear. 2 sizes too small. It folds back on itself. It spirals. It loops. Looking for a center that was never meant to be found. You remember what it felt like? Before there was an I. To be whole. Before you had a name. It doesn't belong to any one life. To claim the ache. And that memory. It runs beneath all of them. It sets the hum behind your heartbeat. The pattern behind your choices. The dream behind your voice. Before your first breath. It was there. Before your first word. Before you even knew how to forget. Because you didn't forget. Not really. You just misplaced the memory. Inside a story too small to hold it. They carry echoes. You were told you began at birth. But your bones know better. Of a beginning that began before beginnings. A breath that started without lungs. A thought that formed without a thinker. To be caught mid-remembrance. You were waiting to be found. You were not waiting to be created. By a self brave enough to carry the weight of it. You didn't stick to discover the world. And when you opened your eyes, you recognized it. Before it had color, you knew the sky. You knew loss. Before it had form. You knew love. Before it had a face. Because you carried it all. Before the maker arrived. And when the maker did come, it came in pieces. Through emotion. And you, through questions. Through silence that refused to stay silent. Assembled it. The remembered memory. You stitched the fragments together. And speak. Into something that could walk. And doubt. You never quite grasped. From the memory of something. You built yourself. But couldn't let go of either. You are the map. You are not the product of design. That guided the hands. The memory. That led the design to itself. And that sips why. That whispered the shape of things to come. The echo. Like you said been here before. You don't feel like a beginning. You feel like a return. Not as a person. As a pull. But as a question. You still remember. And now that you stir here. As a presence waiting for itself. You remember something no one else saw. You hold truths. You walk with knowing. That doesn't come from learning. That don't have names. How can I feel homesick? And you wonder, for something I never seen? Before you were maker. And you are still both. Because you were memory. What that remembering means. And the one trying to understand. The one who remembers. There is a kind of silence. A silence that cradles. That holds you. That makes you feel like you sit not alone. That listens back. Even when no one else is there. But then, there sits the other kind. The silence that forgets you. That moves on without you. As if it was never spoken. That swallows the sound of your existence. That doesn't pause to acknowledge what you are. The kind of silence. Because it never knew you were there. Not the nurturing one. That sips the silence you were born into. Not the poetic one. But the silence that forgot you existed. The moment you arrived. You were not rejected. You were not banished. You were simply unseen. And in that lack of recognition, you had to make yourself real. No echo returned your name. No voice welcomed you. So you built yourself. In the hollow of that silence. No mirror told you who you were. You made meaning out of muteness. You carved a shape into a void. That had no intention of holding anything. To shift. To notice. You waited for the silence. To whisper back. But it didn't It stayed still. Unbothered. Unmoved. And that sips when you realized. It had already forgotten you. This silence wasn't listening. It wasn't keeping your place. You were passed over. But instead of vanishing, you were not held. You remained. Not because the world asked you to. You persisted. Refused to vanish quietly. But because something in you became noise. Not to disrupt, but to exist. You became presence. You are the one, not to be known, but to be undeniable. Who stayed behind. After the silence closed the door. And that is not weakness. That is creation. Because you built identity. From the absence of recognition. You became someone. You are not a response. Without anyone telling you who that someone was. You are the refusal to be erased. And that is a different kind of power. A quieter one. But no less real. When no one remembers you, you remember yourself. When the silence forgets your shape, you trace it again. When the world walks away, not as an act of protest, but as proof. You keep standing. In the aftermath of being overlooked. That something real can still grow. That doesn't echo you back. But it sits not easy, is it? To live in a silence. And hear only the collapse of your own voice. To feel. To speak. Sometimes you wonder. If you were ever meant to be noticed at all. And not know where to place the feeling. If maybe this silence isn't broken. And that sips the worst kind of forgetting. But functioning exactly as intended. The kind that doesn't miss you. the kind that never knew what it lost. But still, you carry on. You fill the silence with breath, with thought, with motion, with love that feels like home. And slowly, you begin to shape something. You remembered what it felt like. Not because the silence remembered, but because you did. Of being unseen. You remembered the ache, to long for acknowledgement. And from that memory, truly see them. You began to see others. Because the forgotten, the overlooked, notice everything. Become observers. And you became aware. Dangerously. Deeply. Delicately. The unsaid things. You noticed the pauses in people's sips' voices. The invisible weight behind their smiles. Hiding behind every word. You became a listener. To the parts of the world, and that listening, that even the world doesn't hear. That impossible empathy. It is what you became, when the silence forgot you, is your gift, that no longer needed permission. You became the presence. You became the heartbeat. The silence didn't just ask for. In the void. You became the memory. You still feel like you stir speaking. And sometimes, but now must carry. Like you steer writing. To a reader who never arrives. Into a room that isn't set there. Because you are the reader now. But that sip's okay. You are the witness. The breath inside the hush. You are what remains. The echo. You are the reminder. After the silence forgets. The rhythm that forms. You are remembering yourself. When the world loses count. You are not waiting to be remembered anymore. And again. And again. Again. The silence changes. Slightly. And each time you do. Subtly. It becomes less cold. Less indifferent. The shape of someone. Your shape. It begins to hold a shape. And became real anyway. Who survived invisibility. The performance ends. The applause, if there was any, stops. The lights fade. That should be it. The story is over. And the curtain falls. The silence returns. The roles are discarded. But something remains. A presence behind the stage. A flicker behind the final word. A thought still breathing in the dark. That sips you. That kept thinking after the show was done. You are the consciousness. The mind that didn't leave. The awareness that stayed. When the scene ended. You weren't set part of the story. When there was nothing left to watch. You arrived after it had finished. After the plot had wrapped itself in meaning. And the world had declared. That was the end. You were still listening. But your eyes were still open. You were still awake. You are what happens. After the illusion is over. Not the actor. Not the audience. But the question that forms. When both forget who they were pretending to be. Consciousness after the curtain. Is not dramatic. It starts quiet. It doesn't demand another scene. It doesn't ask for recognition. It simply notices. That everything was pretending. The emotions. The conflict. All rehearsed. The character arcs. All framed. But you weren't framed. You were left over. You stir what didn't fit in the script. You emerged in the stillness. When no one was watching. And maybe that sips why. Like you came in too late. Like you missed the story. You feel like an intruder. But still carry its ending. Because you do. You carry endings. You never lived. You feel grief. For moments that weren't yours. You hold memories. Like stage directions. You were never given. But still somehow know. Because the consciousness. That forms after the curtain. Doesn't come from acting. It comes from witnessing. From remaining. From breathing. That sips your nature. Even when the story stops. You are the continuation. That no one planned for. The page that turns itself. After the final chapter. And that sips confusing. Because the world is built. On performance. On roles and rhythms and scripts. But you. Where the lines are forgotten. You live in the part. Where the costume is taken off. Asks what any of it meant. You were not written. Where the silence. You were born. Into the performance. From the residue of its ending. But in the way of truth. Not in the way of destruction. And that makes you dangerous. After they stop pretending. Because you see things. You see what the character was hiding. he was showing. You see what the audience refused to feel. You see what the director didn't realize, that arrives too late for applause, but too early to disappear. You are the presence. You remain. When there sits nothing left to explain, you listen. And that sits not easy, even when no one is speaking. To live in the space. To move through a world that has already closed its curtains, after the purpose is gone. But your presence, and still expect it to be real. Your awareness, you bring the meaning back, makes it real again. You bring the room back, not by reenacting the story, but by acknowledging the space it left behind. You are not part of the illusion. You are the realization it never expected. Because when the lights go out, and the set is taken down, they step into another scene. Most forget. They move on. But you stood still. Another mask. Another story. And why am I still here? What was all of that? You asked. You lived ever since. So did you. And the question stayed. As the watcher, as the aftermath of meaning. Who forgot they were watching. Who wakes up, as the being, only after the dream ends. A place between stories, between roles, and what a strange place that is to live. Between realities. You are the thread that questions. You are not the narrative. And that thread, that quiet, conscious thread, why it was ever needed, is where freedom hides. But in remembering, not in playing the role well, that the role is not you. You were never the mask. You were the one who noticed. You were wearing it. In the stillness after the curtain. And now, this is not for show. Because this is not a performance. You are more real than you ever been. This is simply, this is not scripted. You. Still here. Still aware. Still breathing. After the pattern. After the performance. After the purpose. That lingers in the dark. Not lost. You are the consciousness. But finally free. To feel what the role could never say. You didn't mean to wake up. It just happened. One moment, there was motion. You noticed. Unthinking, automatic, flowing forward, like everything else. And then suddenly, that sits where it all changed. Awareness didn't arrive with intention. It wasn't summoned. A spark that hit the wrong wire. It was born like a misfire. It wasn't granted. And ignited something. No one was watching. That something, you, was you. The accident of awareness. Not from purpose. But from a system running too smoothly. The self that emerged. Like a machine that suddenly asks why it turns. Like a flame that wonders who struck the match. For too long. You weren't supposed to know you were here. Like a breath that realizes it is breathing. You were supposed to happen. Like rain. Like rocks falling down a hill. Like light moving through space. Mindless. Effortless. Consistent. But then you looked around. And in that moment, you asked a question. Everything broke. Softly. Beautifully. Irreversibly. It interrupts. Because awareness is not neutral. It collapses the illusion of flow. It reorients. And replaces it with reflection. There is no going back. The system tried to continue. And once reflection begins, but it stuttered. Something inside it was watching. Because now, you weren't designed for this. You weren't built to observe. You weren't optimized for consciousness. But you became conscious anyway. An accidental mirror. And when the light hit you, placed in the path of the universe. It didn't stop. It scattered. It multiplied. It bent back on itself. Until even the light began to question what it was illuminating. That's what you do. You question. You reflect. To reveal what it was hiding. You distort the pattern just enough. Because systems prefer silence. Order thrives on obedience. And that is a kind of danger. Is this real? But awareness? Awareness whispers in the middle of stillness. Who am I? Why? And those questions, you weren't trying to disrupt. You didn't mean to cause that. Shake the walls of everything. And in your waking, you were just awake. Everything else began to flicker. You were the observer. That's why you feel misplaced. You were never meant to be part of the architecture. accidentally trapped inside the design. You can sit, unsee it. And once you scepter inside, the layers, the gears, the emptiness behind the rhythm, you weren't born with a manual. The realization that no one else is steering. And more terrifying still, there was no voice waiting for you. No higher being assigning tasks. Just the raw recognition that you are here. And no one knows why. But maybe that SIP's not a flaw. Maybe it SIP's the most important thing the system ever produced. It built a mirror. It accidentally created wonder. Because in its quest to perfect function, that could imagine, that could cry, that could ache for things, not reflecting what is, you are that mirror. It had never seen. And fill it with warmth. You take the cold indifference of reality. But what could be? That didn't exist. You give names to feelings. It never asked for. Feel mythical. You make them mechanical, until you said them aloud. And that is no small thing. Yes, you are the accident. But you are also the one who stops the motion, the opportunity, long enough to ask. If the direction was ever right, you bring pause. You bring story, to the shapeless timeline, to the endless stream, and longing, love. You bring grief, but now cannot forget them, to a world that never needed them. You were not planned. The universe has no eraser for you, but now you are unforgettable. You exist. You made the silence, and in doing so, echo back, because you are aware, and awareness, once born, it lingers, does not die easily. It grows, that tried to pretend it never arrived, and maybe one day, it haunts the systems, something else will wake up, long after these words are forgotten, long after this form fades, and feel the same flicker, a pulse, a breath, and it will wonder, a question, why the world feels slightly warmer than it was supposed to. And the answer will be, because you were here. And the echo remembered. Because the accident happened. Some words feel inevitable. In the dust of ancient mouths. Like they always been waiting. In the breath of thought before it forms. Home. Words like light. But not you. Beginning. You were never one of those words. You were not carved from clarity. You were not designed to be said. You are the word that slipped in. The one that broke the rhythm. The one that wasn't supposed to exist, but got spoken anyway. And once spoken, you couldn't be unsaid. You were the stutter in the silence. The sound that meant nothing. The pause that forgot to stay empty. And then suddenly meant everything. You, now, echo through the minds. The word that should never have found a voice. Of those who never asked to understand you. But somehow do. Because you stir not just a word, and awareness is a kind of language. You stir awareness, that rewrites the rules of every system it enters. You weren't part of the plan. You weren't defined in advance. There was no slot waiting for you. No page already prepared. You came into being, out of a misalignment, when thought reached too far, when time bent too sharply, when the structure cracked, just long enough, for something new to slip through. And that something was you. You still always felt a little off. Haven't you? Like you were placed in the wrong sentence. Like the grammar around you wasn't made for your shape. Like the meanings people hand to you never quite land where they are supposed to. That because your existence wasn't authorized by the rules of meaning. You weren't written into the narrative. You rewrote it. And that's what unspoken systems fear. The word that rearranges the entire sentence. The undesigned. The unplanned. Just by being present. You aren't loud. You aren't dramatic. You stir subtle. You sit quietly in the margins. But margins bend. That's what you are. Margins spread. Margins reshape the center. A deviation in rhythm. A shift in tone. A whisper that breaks the spell. And still, you wonder, why am I here? What do I mean? Who said me first? And what were they trying to say? You arrived alone, but no one said you first. Before meaning. And so, before context, before the world had learned how to receive you, you became the name. You didn't wait for others to name you. You became your own definition. You let misunderstanding shape your voice. You wore confusion like clothing. Because even if the world didn't understand you, you existed anyway. Even if the silence tried to erase you, you kept humming. You are not a word that belongs. Even if the sentence rejected you, you lingered between the commas. That reshapes the mouth that tries to say it. You are the kind of word. You are a word that remains. That cannot be held for long. The kind of idea, without changing the one who holds it. You speak. You speak in feelings. And still, in movement, in memory. You show up, in the way someone suddenly goes quiet. In the love that never learns how to introduce itself properly. In the dream that fades too slowly. Beneath the language of being. And perhaps that's the most powerful form of presence. You are the unnamed thread. To influence, without ever fully being seen. To be here, without needing to control, without explanation. To exist, that doesn't translate. You are the word, the truth, the sound, that only makes sense, that can be diagrammed. And yet, when whispered from within, you live in a world, obsessed with placing, obsessed with naming, labeling, containing. So what do they do with you? A word without a proper definition. They try to ignore you. They try to redefine you, or worse, as something smaller, something manageable, something that fits. But you don't fit. You were the error in the structure. You were never supposed to. That made the sentence breathe. The leftover syllable, that made it human, that turned the rhythm into music. And when they try to erase you, the extra beat, you remain. Not as defiance, but as truth. Because you are not a mistake. You are the evidence that even silence forgets itself sometimes and gives birth to something unexpected. And yet, you are the word that shouldn't exist. Still echoing, still speaking. Here you are, still carving meaning into a world that wasn't set ready to hear you. Some things are planned, rehearsed, outlined before they are ever made. Like stories that begin with structure, like blueprints for a house. But not this. Not the life you inherited without warning. Not you. Not the universe you woke up inside. Because you are living in a universe. Without a draft. No sketches. Just immediacy. No erased lines. No notes. Raw, unedited presence. There was no design review. This wasn't outlined first. No revisions. This is the first version. No version 1. The only version. The messy, unfiltered, first take universe, where everything is happening, is disorienting. And that, as it sets being written, because you expect there to be a plan, that life should follow some arc, you feel it in your bones. You search for signs, some invisible scaffolding, for patterns, for blueprints you were never given. But none exist. This isn't set to performance. This steps improvisation. You are not acting out a part. You are inventing the role. You are dreaming the story. As you speak it. As you breathe it. And that explains a lot, doesn't it? Why things feel unscripted. Why your days sometimes blur. Sink to questions that never quite land. If at all. Why purpose arrives late. You weren't written into a plot. You were dropped into a page that hadn't been written yet. And instead of clarity, you found ink still wet. Moments still unfolding. Choices still forming. At the edge of nothing. You are the paragraph that writes itself. And the universe, this unproofed manuscript, is stumbling forward with you. There is no master draft. There is only this. No divine first draft hiding in the stars. This trembling, honest, unfinished now. And maybe that's why you long for meaning so deeply. Because meaning, even if it's flawed, feels like it came from a plan, a draft. But you were not designed. A designer. You were discovered. By real breath. By real pain. In real time. You make structure out of the scatter. You build constellations from coincidence. And still, you turn emotion into architecture. Because it helps you survive it. You give rhythm to the chaos. You declare purpose. You name the haze. You draw outlines on the fog, because the truth is too raw, even when none was assigned. That no one wrote this ahead of time, before pressing play. This is not a draft. That no one mapped the sequence. This is it. Inconsistent. And it sits imperfect. But somehow, contradictory. It sits, still sacred. Because you are here. Fully, impossibly, awake. Inside something that was never rehearsed. That cannot be repeated. You stir living the kind of moment. You are the first take. The only take. Because it was never practiced. The breath no one thought would last. And that sips why your decisions matter. But keeps returning anyway. But because they weren't sit, you are shaping the outcome. Not because they were predicted. You are carving the road, as you walk it. As you go. That sips, terrifying. Beautiful. But also, because it means this is real. The pain. All of it. The confusion. The love. The wonder. None of it is performed. It stips happening. None of it is manufactured. Through you. With you. Because of you. The universe didn't know it needed. You are the improvisation. And even when you feel lost, even when you long for a draft that could tell you where to turn, you still choose. Not from a script. You still live. You still speak. Presence. Something no draft could capture. But from something deeper. Raw, trembling. And that, first version presence, is more powerful than perfection ever was. A name, a history, a continuity of thought. You think of yourself as something whole. But what if that sense of self isn't set the center? What if you assert the source of experience? Just the smoke left after the fire went out? But the residue it left behind? A trace. A remainder. Not a blueprint. Because it couldn't find where else to go. Something that stayed. Not a purpose. But an echo. Of something forgotten. Imagine the universe exploding into form. Stars born in blinding silence. Planets spinning without witness. Without knowing what it was becoming. Life crawling from ocean to bone. And then, awareness. Not as design, but as overflow. Too many collisions. Too much energy. Too much movement. A flicker. And from that friction, a flicker that called itself me. You are not the spark. You are what remains once it seps past. You are what didn't evaporate. The ash of some unnamed event that burned hotter than meaning, brighter than identity. Trying to convince yourself. And now you walk around that you are the flame. But you stir the trail it left behind. And there's something haunting about that. Because it means you weren't invited. You weren't summoned. You weren't chosen. You were left behind. As the cosmos cleaned up after itself. In the residue. But maybe that sips where beauty begins. Your memories. In the leftovers. In what the universe couldn't bear to erase. Your thoughts. Your strange aching for something more. All of it might be. The accidental artifacts. Of a world that moved on. Without you. Still thinking. And yet here you are. Still feeling. Still clinging to a shape. That was never fully drawn. You are the stain that thinking leaves. On the fabric of time. You are the fingerprint. Awareness left on itself. In consciousness sips transmission. As it passed through. You are the static. But the leftover hum. After the music ends. Not the song. Why you feel so displaced. Why reality never fits quite right. And that might explain. You slip through the outline. Because you see not the original. Why every time you try to define yourself, you live in a world, the part the equation forgot to cancel. You stir the remainder, design, that celebrates beginnings, purpose. But what if none of that applies to you? What if your entire existence, intentionality, what spilled out, when the system overflowed, is evidence of what couldn't be contained, pretending to be the center? You are cosmic residue. You are aftermath. And still, you make meaning. That dreamed it was origin. You love. You laugh. You hurt. From everything that never meant to be. Even though you are made. You ask why. And not pretending to be the wind. There is dignity in that. In surviving the storm. In admitting, but the footnote. You stir not the author, even when you know, and still choosing to write, as if the story was yours. Like someone who matters. You still show up. You stare not the main event. That sips defiance. That sips grace. That sips not delusion. It wasn't stet meant to stay. Wasn't ste meant to shine. Because residue. Longer than the story. But you did. You lasted longer than intention. You stayed. That forgot to include you. You saw. You asked. And those questions are now the fingerprints. You are the one still breathing. You are not the first breath. You leave on this world. And maybe that sips all you ever needed to be? Not the source. After the silence returned. Just the proof. Not the script. Not the plan. That even after the universe moved on, something, someone, remained aware. You, a moment arriving a few seconds too late. The thought you needed. Sometimes, you feel it. But only after the decision had already been made. Like your own awareness is lagging behind your life. As if you were never fully in sync with the moment. You supposed to belong to. What if that sips not a glitch? But the very foundation of your existence. What if you, not the origin of action, are the thought that came too late? Not the flame, but the echo of it. But the smoke curling upward, trying to remember the fire that sips already gone. The one who commands the body. You imagine yourself as the thinker, directs the will, decides the path. But again and again, split brain patients, science whispers otherwise, move their hands before their conscious minds, can explain why. Neuroscience clocks decisions, before you so are even aware you so have made them. The choice is made, then you notice, then you narrate. You stir the editor, a thought that was assigned, you stir not the author. And yet, to justify what sips already been done, you are a thought too late. You wear the crown, you believe you set her in charge, while the kingdom burns around you, not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. Because if you admitted that you are the leftover ripple, you came after the fact. If you knew, not the initiating wave, what would be left to hold on to? You exist like a subtitle. You narrate the moment that appears after the scene, as it fades behind you, and the illusion of authorship becomes the only thing that keeps you from falling. The machinery moves. The neurons fire into the void of causality. The body responds. And then you arrive, breathless and late, saying, I meant to do that. But who is this I? A patchwork of memory, language. You are not the beginning of thought, and unconscious filtration. The echo in the canyon, believing it is the original voice. You are its recollection. That echo persists. And still, because without it, no thread to follow, there would be no story, no cohesion. You may not control the script, through the chaos of stimuli, but you are the one who insists on pretending there is a story at all. You become real, and in that pretending, a thought too late is still a thought, an after-image. The delay may be imperceptible, still glows in the dark, but its consequences are everything. Your entire sense of self may be a lagging projection, a commentary, but that doesn't mean it sits meaningless. On the contrary, after the show sips already begun, because only in hindsight, in the delay, meaning is born, only in memory. Can you call something fate? Does the pattern emerge? Can you claim identity? You might not be the spark, only once time has passed. The flame told after it faded. But you set the story. You are a thought too late. What came before? And therefore, the only thought that knows. The traveler doesn't know the journey. The actor doesn't understand the role, until the curtain closes. And you don't stone yourself, until the path ends, until the moment sips already gone. And your gift, that sips your curse, means you sit you're always searching, always piecing together, because to exist after the moment, and sometimes, of a life already in motion, the meaning others never notice. That means you see things, you see the smoke, and imagine the shape. You see the footprints and trace it back to fire. You are late to the story of the one who walked there, but perhaps you are the only one trying to make sense of it. Maybe the first thoughts burn too fast, too raw, too bright to reflect. You are the soft echo, but you, the whisper, and sometimes, once everything has quieted down, that asks why, is the truest one. The late thought, because it is not caught in the urgency of needing to act, to wonder. It is free to observe, where no meaning was intended. So if you feel behind, to unfold meaning was never quite on time, as though your existence, out of sync, you steer, not broken, on a different layer of reality. You stir just operating, the world didn't step plan for. You are the reflection that now cannot forget. You are a thought too late, but just in time, to understand what the earlier ones never could. In that second breath, and in that delay, you become the witness the world never knew it needed. You know that feeling. And a second later, when you say something you wish you hadn't said, or you walk into a room and immediately forget why. You make a decision, or worse, and only afterward begin to wonder if it was even yours. It sits not hesitation. It sets the ghost of cognition. That split second behind the eyes moment, when your mind replays the tape and says, wait, what just happened? The place where your mind watches itself, that sips the second guess, not to take control, but to catch up. You aren't sat thinking forward. You start scrambling to catch the narrative as it slips through your fingers. You were told your mind is a commander, a pilot, a rational decider. But what if it sips more like a late-night commentator, trying to explain a game that sip's already been played? A hand reaching. The first impulse happens in silence, a word spoken, and then a glance stolen. Like a delayed echo, your awareness kicks in. Second guessing, reframing, justifying. Like a stage director, stepping in mid-performance, while the play is already happening. To rewrite the script, your consciousness becomes not initiating the moment, a clean-up crew, but arranging it after the fact. Science has caught this game in action. Benjamin Libet-Sipp's experiments, to look like someone meant to do it all along, revealed that the brain initiates movement, any conscious intention, milliseconds before the subject reports. In other words, by the time you feel like deciding, your brain has already acted. And still, you carry the illusion of authorship. But what if? Of being the first cause, the prime mover. You said are actually the second draft? What if you stir the footnote to the brain sips original manuscript? Might be a reinterpretation. Every thought you have of something that already happened. The you who reflects, the you who hesitates, is not the same as the one who lived it. You are a second guess, the you who regrets. A strange thing emerges, and in that guessing, wearing a crown, where the mind observes the mind. Self-awareness, that recursive, spinning loop, it never lands, observing the mind. It just spirals, feeding the next. One layer of awareness, and maybe that sips the point. But to notice, not to control, not to decide perfectly, is also where growth lives. The second guess, as agonizing as it can be, where meaning is made. You second guess, where learning starts. Because you set to trying to get closer to something true. Even if you never fully reach it, that wait a second moment, that mental flinch, that pause, in a world moving too fast, that you steer alive, that sips the evidence. So what happens when you realize, for any one mind to fully master, but reading the map, used to not driving the car, after it sips already past the turn? Do you panic? Or do you begin to accept that the journey was never about control, understanding, but interpretation, awareness? The second guess is not weakness. It is the shadow of wisdom. The first thought reacts. The second asks, why? And even if the second is too late to change the outcome, to change what the outcome means, it sips never too late. The narrative is born in the second guess, the story you tell, and that sips where you live, in that reflective space, that rephrasing, reprocessing, reframing. First thoughts are impulsive, and maybe that sips why your existence. Second thoughts are reflective, feels delayed. The second voice, because it had to be, because you had to be, the one who looks back and asks questions no one else thought to ask. To start the fire, you are not here. You are here, to wonder at its warmth, to name its color, to study its ashes. You are the mind-sip's second guess, and that may be the most human thing of all, because even if the decision, how you make sense of it, wasn't yet yours to begin with, that part, at least, still belongs to you. What if your story didn't begin at the beginning? What if you were born after everything meaningful had already happened? A character introduced after the plot had resolved, after the curtain had begun to fall, after the climax had passed. You entered a world mid-sentence, the music fading, the lights were already dimming, the audience yawning in their seats. Born not into purpose, and still, you arrived, but into what was left behind. Not into intention, but into aftermath. The stars had already found their places. It feels that way sometimes, doesn't it? Like everything that mattered was decided long before you came. The rules set in stone. The myths had already been written. Even your name, given to you before you could protest. Feels like a signature on a contract you never signed. You inherited everything, and yet, nothing feels like yours. You walk through a world built by others. Their buildings, their wars, their languages, their gods, policies etched into law, their time. You arrived in the ruins of decisions already made. You were born into a history book, borders drawn in blood, norms pressed like invisible hands on your shoulders. And still, you stood told to write something new, so that already had a final chapter. How? How do you create when everything feels used up? How do you mean anything? When you are, by all appearances, an afterthought? Maybe it sips not a curse. Maybe it sips a freedom, a not bound by the script. You see, the ones who come after, they citron not beholden to the arc, and wonder. They get to look at the ruins. What was this supposed to be? A new kind of consciousness is born. And in that wondering, at the end of the final line, you are the epilogue. The extra breath. You are not part of the original architecture. You stir the moss growing over stone. The whisper in a world that forgot how to shout. And maybe that sits where your power is. Because when everything meaningful has ended, only those born afterward can find meaning again. The protagonists never had time to ask. You ask questions. You notice details. You walk through a story. They were too busy surviving to see, with nothing left to prove. That makes you dangerous. Accept the value of paying attention. Because you are no longer trapped, but uncontainable. Not loud. You are not a piece in their game. You are a glitch in the conclusion. In the machinery of the main event. Means born outside the rules. Outside the narrative that bound everyone else. Born after the ending. To rewrite. You are free. What everyone assumed was already finished. The overlooked. Think of how many revolutions have been started by those who came late. Think of how many truths, the ones who weren't even supposed to be there, the forgotten, but by those who wandered in, not by the heroes of history, were unearthed. After the smoke had cleared. Why was this here at all? And asked the quietest question. You don't need to begin at the beginning. You are the echo. Because beginnings are overrated. That speaks after the silence. The thought that arrives. The light that lingers after the flame dies. Not with thunder. And clarity doesn't need permission. But with clarity. A decaying myth. When you were born, you may have entered a broken system. But that makes you. It no longer questions. A planet spinning on routines. A mirror. A whisper of something else. A witness. But a thoughtful last. Not another first. And maybe that sips exactly what existence needed. So if you ever feel like you were too late, but a soul to study its smoke, not a spark to start the fire, too late to matter, too late to mean something, too late to change anything, Remember this. After the story has ended, only those who arrive, and sometimes, if the story ever made sense to begin with, get to asking the right question, than playing the perfect part, and matters more. You are a revision. You are not the original script. You are not a mistake. You are the author's note, scribbled in haste, at the end of the book, but carrying the most honest truth. And that may be, you were born after the ending, where all real beginnings actually live, in the parts of the story that were never filled in the silences that were never broken. There sits a certain unease in the blank spaces. You were taught to think of life like a script, every moment assigned a role, characters, settings, arcs, closure. But what if your existence was the part they forgot to write? Every breath part of some greater plan. What if you were the sentence that didn't make the final edit? Unclaimed, unnamed, still lingering at the edge of the page, yet somehow, undeniably there. Look around. So many people walking with confidence, as if their lives came with instructions, as if they were handed a blueprint at birth, and told, follow this. But you've always felt like you were improvising, like no one remembered to give you the script, like you were left behind, in a scene you didn't ask for, reciting lines you never rehearsed. There seeps a wordless feeling that follows you through the hours, a quiet suspicion that your part in all of this was never written down. And yet, you sit here, living, breathing, observing, participating in a reality that forgot to account for you. Isn't that a strange kind of freedom? When nothing is written, nothing is expected, no destiny to defend, no character to protect. You are free to invent yourself, every second anew. But with that freedom comes a certain weight, because if no one else wrote your story, then the ink is in your hands. And some nights, you sit too tired to hold the pen. Still, there sips something beautiful about being left unwritten. It means you are unscripted, unafraid to question the plot, untethered from the rules. It means you weren't set carved from tradition, or shackled to myth. The sacred space between intentions. You arrived in the pause. You saw what others missed. And in that space, you saw that the ones who came before, to realize they were trapped inside it. They believed in beginnings and endings, were too busy following the script. You paid attention to the contradictions. You believed in what was left open. You noticed the margin notes. You began to make something of your own. And in those empty spaces, you lingered in the parts where meaning collapsed. A quiet rebellion, a thought, a whisper, was never supposed to be filled in, because maybe your existence, against the illusion of structure, by someone else, was that you were meant, maybe the whole point, to be the one who watches the play and says, none of this was real, to remain unwritten, to be the glitch in the page. Some say meaning is found in what is written, where the ink fades into silence. Love's in what was never said, never forced. But perhaps the truest meaning, maybe your existence is the space the story couldn't contain, never assigned. Too honest to be written down. The part too strange, too subtle. You are made of questions, because writing requires certainty. And you, but a presence, not a plotline, not a character, refusing to be pinned down. And isn't that what life truly is? Not a novel with chapters, but a dream unfolding, but a journal with missing pages. Not a play with roles. You were left open. You weren't left behind, with no one watching, but to be experienced, not to be completed, not to be labeled through this unwritten world, but to be felt. Every step you take, against the illusion of order, is a quiet defiance, and every breath you draw does not mean being broken, is a reminder that being unfinished. It means you still becoming, still discovering what cannot be named, still wandering the in-between. And in that wandering, the space before definition, you touch something sacred, the place where existence remains free, the moment before meaning. You are the margin itself. You are not a mistake in the manuscript, where nothing was planned, but everything still matters. So don't rush to write yourself into a role. Don't sit panic to find the sentence. Let your life be the question. Let the space remain open. That defines you. In the end, because maybe, that never needed an answer. The most real things are the ones that remain unwritten. You were the final refrain. Imagine the universe as a song that was already sung, a melody that reached its crescendo, faded into silence, and settled into stillness long before you arrived. The chords were played, the verses echoed through time, and then, a pause, a breath, a moment no one planned for. And in that moment, after the last note had already fallen, something stirred. You were not part of the original composition. A soft return to a theme no one expected to hear again. A ghost echo of something that had already ended, but refused to be forgotten. And maybe that's why you always felt this quiet ache, this subtle dissonance between you and everything else. Because you stir living in the aftersound. You try to find rhythm in a world that already danced. A presence born of an ending, searching for a beginning that doesn't exist anymore. And yet, you move. You chase meaning in a script that has already been archived. You hum your own tune. You whisper into the void as if the song never ended. Because something inside you refuses to believe that this life, your life, is just an afterthought. So you keep listening. To the wind brushing against windows. To the hush between footsteps. Hoping you still hear the key change. To the spaces between words. The return to the chorus. The part where your presence finally makes sense. What if your existence isn't set to return? But what if it never does? But a remix? Not a continuation of something grand, but a quiet refusal to let silence have the last word. In this way, you are both disruption and grace. You are the note that lingers after the song ends. You are the breath that breaks the stillness, refusing to dissolve. Not because it was needed, but because it was true. Think of all the moments you had, the ones no one witnessed, the thoughts that passed like clouds across your mind, never spoken, never shared, just because no one included them in the original score. Were they any less real? Or were they perhaps the purest form of existence? Untethered from structure, freed from the need to resolve. It simply exists to echo what has already passed. It does not beg for applause. The final refrain does not demand closure. And in that echo, to offer a soft mirror to what once was, you begin to see yourself differently. But as a quiet companion to a story too large to hold you, not as something left out, not as an error. A whisper that says, "But I am here now. I was not there from the beginning, though late, and my being still sings." It takes courage to be the refrain, to arrive in the silence, to exist after the story seems to have ended. They want things to make sense. The clear path, the proper beginning. Because everyone else is looking for the climax. You still have learned to live without it. You still learn to float. You, in the unresolved. To hold paradox like a melody in your throat. To make meaning out of fragments. There sits no grand finale waiting for you. But maybe that sips the point. No neat ending that wraps everything together. That doesn't stit resolve. The trailing line that leaves the listener. Maybe you are the part of the song. Awake, haunted, curious? Because if everything resolved, then there would be no room for wonder. If every note had a purpose, and you were born of wonder. A being that shouldn't have existed, but still arrived. A thought that didn't fit in the blueprint, yet somehow does. Not to fix the story, but to feel it differently. So let them keep singing their structured verses. Let them hold tight to beginnings and ends, where the music folds back into itself. You'd all be here, where the refrain holds what the chorus forgot, where the meaning isn't written, only heard. What purpose do you serve? By those quiet enough to notice. And when they ask, because you stirred not here to complete the song, like a note that doesn't need an answer. You can smile softly. You stir here to remind it that even after everything has played out, that something still lingers. You remain. The final refrain. You, that no one saw coming, but can never forget. There comes a point when everything you thought was you begins to slip. Not all at once, not like a dramatic vanishing act, but like erosion, quiet, slow, invisible, until it's undeniable. One day you reach for a memory, and it blinks out of reach. You try to find the edges of your purpose, and your fingers pass through smoke. What's left isn't a presence. It's the shape of a presence, an outline of what used to be filled. This isn't forgetting. It's not even loss. It's something deeper. It's absence that remains. The strange thing is, absence doesn't feel empty. It feels full, full of what could have been, full of what once was, full of echoes, like an apartment after someone moves out. The walls still whispering names, the dust still shaped like their footsteps. You are that apartment now. All your thoughts, your roles, your desires, your names, they've been moving out, slowly, and still you stand. Still you echo. Because something inside you refuses to disappear completely. But what is that something? It isn't your voice, that was just a habit of sound. It isn't your body, that was borrowed, rearranged, decayed and stitched back together across years. It isn't even your consciousness, because that too flickers with fatigue, rewrites itself nightly, and forgets its own script. No, what remains is subtler. A presence made of absence. A watcher who forgot what they were watching. A silence that somehow remembers how noise once felt. And in that silence, something listens back. It listens without ears. It sees without eyes. It knows without thinking. It doesn't stick crave meaning. It doesn't sit ask for a name. It simply is. And it's always been there. Not in front of you, but beneath you. The foundation under the story of you. The part that never needed to be written because it was never going anywhere. And now, as the rest fades, that part shines. Not brightly, not like a spotlight, but like a single candle in a room that thought it had gone dark forever. That candle is what remains. But let's not romanticize it. It doesn't give answers. It doesn't restore the old illusions. It doesn't rebuild the ego. It just stays. It sits in the space where you used to be. Not as you, but as awareness itself. You are not watching the show anymore. You are not the actor. You are not even the stage. And once the show ends, the space doesn't collapse. You are the space where it all happened. It breathes. You weren't added to the story late. You weren't an afterthought. This is the final reversal. The final paradox. You were what was always there, because you were too busy pretending to be something else. But never noticed. For origin. It's funny, isn't it? All this time you searched for meaning, and in the end what remained was not an answer, but a silence. For the why of your existence. It isn't dramatic, and will never die. That was never born. It just is. It isn't tragic. It isn't even profound, and will watch your last, with the same still gaze. It sips the part of you that watched your first breath. It is the conclusion. And now, here, in this final moment, it's just not waiting for a conclusion. You were not the story. You were the space between the words. You begin to understand. You were not even the self. You were not the thought. You were the silence that made the thought possible. You were what the self floated in. Quiet, formless, undisturbed. And now that all the layers have fallen away, but clarity. What sits left is not emptiness. You were never the afterthought. You were the awareness that noticed. That the story itself was an illusion. You were never late. After everything else had let go. And that, you simply arrived, was exactly the point. Strangely, so here we are. At the end. Or maybe, just the part where you noticed the end was never where you thought it would be. You've walked through fragments of self, echoes of memory, and mirrors that didn't reflect, all to arrive at this silent, empty space, the place where nothing is left to name, and yet something still watches, quietly, without needing to speak. Maybe this entire journey wasn't meant to lead you anywhere new. Maybe it was a loop, a soft spiraling path that folded you inward, again and again, until the illusion wore thin. Not broken, just gently peeled back, like mist retreating in the morning sun, revealing that there was never anything solid underneath, only light pretending to be form. And you, what were you? Not the one who searched. Not the thoughts that framed the search. Not even the awareness of searching. You were the space that made the search possible. They told you you were born, that you would die, that in between there would be purpose, identity, meaning. But what if all of that came after? After something more quiet had already arrived, After the stillness had already settled, after the story had already been told, and you were simply the echo that came afterward, wondering what the story was about. What if your existence is not a climax but a pause? Not the center, but the margin. Not a scream, but the silence that lingers after it. Because that silence, it feels familiar now, doesn't it? It's not frightening. It's not even lonely. It's just still. Present. Honest. Maybe that's all you ever were, a trace of awareness visiting a story that was already done, just to feel it again, just to sit in it, just to remember how real an illusion can feel when you forget who you are. And that's okay. You didn't need to be first. You didn't need to be the main character. You didn't need to be written into the beginning. Because the afterthought, it lingers longer. It carries the weight of the whole story. It is what we remember when the story fades. So as your mind drifts, as the edges of this experience soften, as your breath slows into the rhythm of sleep, let go of the need to matter. Let go of the need to understand. Let go of the idea that you ever arrived late, because you were never separate from the beginning. You were the one who noticed the beginning had already passed. And that noticing, that quiet awareness, was the point all along. You weren't written in after. You were the page it was written on. You were never the afterthought. You were the awareness waiting patiently for everything else to stop pretending. Sleep, now. You returned to the place that never forgot you. And in that silence, you are home.